Good afternoon. This is Dyke Hendrickson and the podcast Life Along the Merrimack. Each week we talk about the health and history of the Merrimack River. Frequently we have guests, but much has been going on along the river, and I'm going to be reporting on it myself today. I'm a former reporter with the Daily News here in Newburyport, and I covered the waterfront for 4 or 5 years, so I'm aware of some of the developments. Before that, I was with the Portland Press-Herald and the Boston Herald, so I'm used to gathering information and bringing it to the people. And a lot has been going on in the past few weeks, and that's what I'll be reporting on today. We started doing this program because we were concerned that the cleanliness of the Merrimack River is going backwards, not forwards. In other words, after heavy rainstorms, sewage treatment plants upriver in Haverhill and Lowell and Lawrence and Manchester, New Hampshire, were discharging raw sewage into the river along with the rainwater. Those are called CSOs. And the river, anecdotal evidence from people I run across, as well as from people who have been on this show, say frequently after a big storm, there's, pollutants of many orders in the river. So we do talk about the health of the river, and we talk about the history of this great river. And towards the middle of this show, I'm going to leave my little news presentation and talk about some of the historical elements. So one thing that was unique and good that happened over this past weekend was a group of local, state, and federal officials took a kayak ride down the Merrimack River. Now, many of us do not really know that the river is 117 miles long. So they started in New Hampshire near Lake Winnipesaukee. Actually, it's the Winnipesaukee Stream. And about 8 started. Numerous people joined along the way. And I just want to read the names of some of the people, because this was a great event. Those on the trip included State Senator Diana DiZoglio. She's from Methuen. Representative Christina Minicucci. She is from the North Shore. Dan Grovac of the Merrimack River Watershed Council. Lane Glenn, who is the president of Northern Essex Community College. Derek Mitchell, who is involved in the Lawrence Partnership organization. Representative Jim Kelcourse, who is from Amesbury and who represents Amesbury, Salisbury, and Newburyport. And others including Chamber of Commerce CEO Dugan Sherwood and Groundwork Lawrence Executive Editor Heather McCain. Others did join in, and Mayor Donna Holliday of Newburyport was one of those who was also in on this ride. It was 4 days, so it was about 30 miles a day, and it was done to generate publicity, one might say, or attention, but I think it was very successful. It got quite a bit of newspaper coverage. Some of the Boston TV stations had some clicks on it. And in essence, they were trying to say, this is a great resource, and it should be treated with respect. And they also want to bring forth the fact that the river starts in New Hampshire. Now, this is obvious, of course, but here in Newburyport, we're at the end of the line, so we really get the sewage, the effluent that comes down. But Manchester and Nashua, New Hampshire, are also part of the river, and they're major pollutants. Now, the problem here, or the fly in the ointment, if I can use the term, is that many communities say, we don't have enough money to fix our system. And the Environmental Protection Agency, the federal body, has granted a lot of these cities permits to discharge the effluent because they kind of agree they don't have enough money. But there are several possibilities out there. Some of my guests have brought them up. One person has said, well, how about what they call a rain tax? I met a fellow from Portland, Maine, and he's on a board up there. And he mentioned that about a decade ago, there was a lot of rainwater mixing with sewage and going into Casco Bay. This was a great threat to boating and tourism in Portland. And if you've been to Portland in the last 10 or even 20 years, you realize how remarkable and attractive it is. I mean, you can see the Casco Bay from many areas. The restaurants are great. The boating's terrific, sailing, fishing. They're even getting these monstrous cruise ships in there, which at first, I had lived there in the 70s and 80s. I didn't think it was large enough for cruise ships, but there it is. Portland's very attractive. But back to the story. So what they did in Portland was they were able to have a public information campaign and say, look, when it rains, we get the water going into our sewage treatment plants, and then they can't hold it all, so they discharge it. So we want to start a plan to separate the rainwater so it doesn't go into the sewage treatment plant. And they had a tax, a regional tax, that did charge users. It didn't charge them every time it rained, don't get me wrong, but that's what it was called. And it did charge them for a given amount of precipitation at the end of a year. You get a higher charge the following year. In short, you paid a higher tax, but it did start a program of separating the water from the sewage. And as a result, Casco Bay is much cleaner, and it's considered a success even nationwide. Another element that I would mention in my coverage of different communities, I've found that there are regional sewerage districts. In other words, there are about 16 to 20 communities in Newburyport, on the North Shore, that are coterminous to the river. I hate to use large words, so I would say adjacent to the river. Perhaps there'll come a time when they could have a district, and everybody in the district will be charged an extra $5 or $10 or whatever per year, so that this separation of the pipes from the water pipes from the sewage pipes could take place, and we could have a cut down on sewage in the Merrimack River. Now, this is not a small thing. It's, hundreds of millions of gallons are let out each year. And we must remember that about 600,000 people in the Lawrence area get their drinking water from the Merrimack River. So, of course, the water is purified, and they have a lot of science there, so the water in Lawrence is good. But we must always remember that this is an asset, and we've got to keep it clean. So having a regional district is one possibility. Another would be having a situation where there would be people, industries, and organizations that are involved come together and work together to make a commission and have many communities, 16 to 20 here, also communities up in New Hampshire, say this is a big problem and we're going to work on it. To that end, there is progress. The Merrimack River Commission is back in business. I say back in business. This is a little odd. There's a story here. About 3 months ago, a group met over at the Northern Essex Community College and said, okay, we're going to be the Merrimack River Commission. We're going to ask for $50,000 so we can meet 3 or 4 times a year and bring many people together. And they did. And $50,000 was indeed put into the state budget for the commission, but it did not make the final cut, as they say in the sports field. It was cut from the budget. There's no $50,000. In the last week, and we did say it was a big week, $50,000 was put back in the budget. It's now in the state Senate. It's got to go to the House. It's got to be approved. But that $50,000 is still hanging out there. And so a commission, I think, would be helpful. Also, there's $100,000, which has been approved for a pilot program to create a warning system so that people downriver would know when there's been a big discharge. Now, this is certainly attractive for people in Newburyport, Salisbury, Amesbury, people, where we are from this broadcast, because we're at the end of the line. We get a lot of effluent. And this is Mayor Donna Holliday, who has been very active in trying to move clean water forward, recently told me that she's working with Boston University to create a plan that would enable people to be warned. Now, this would have a lot of coordination involved. For instance, if the Haverhill sewage treatment plant has a big discharge, they would be compelled to call up somebody, either at BU or at a commission, and say, we have let 2 million gallons of sewage into the Merrimack River. That information would be taken, perhaps it would be on an online app, perhaps there would be flags put along the river at strategic spots, or at marinas, or in front of the harbor master's headquarters in Newburyport, to tell people that, hey, you remember that rain 2 days ago upriver? Well, there were significant discharges, and it's heading this way. So we suggest you not go swimming, and we suggest that you not let your dogs go swimming. Curiously, dogs are playing a big role here, because numerous dog lovers who go to, say, Cashman Park, or they go to different areas, even on the waterfront near the old restaurants near Michael's, their dogs go in the water. And I've heard of several cases where owners say, this is not good because our dog came down with a rash or sores. And so when it's polluted, it is quite polluted. And, old-timers know about this. Charlie Tartar, who's a city councilor now, was on this program last week, and he was talking about when he was a young guy in the 70s, he went to Georgetown University and was on the crewing team. The rowing team, which is crew. And they came up here for a competition on the Merrimack River, and he and his partner tipped their vessel over. They went into the Merrimack, and his officials come running down and say, hey, river is really polluted. You've got to get to the hospital. So he went to the hospital, took a shower. I think he got a tetanus shot. Excuse me. And so, but it just shows you the regard people had for the river. Like, wait a second, this guy just fell in. We've got to wash him off him and, get him a tetanus shot. So Charlie did bring that back. And in the early 70s, and earlier in the 50s and 60s, it was very polluted. And so in the 70s, following the Clean Water Act, that was a federal measure, it got much cleaner. As a result, recreational boating is very popular. I think everyone knows that here on the Merrimack River. In Newburyport alone, there are 1,500 vessels registered, and there are also many vessels in Salisbury, Amesbury, going up the river to Haverhill and even farther than that. So it's become a recreational gem, which also means it's a very significant economic driver here. Newburyport itself doesn't have many motels, but it has many boats where people stay overnight. And so they go to restaurants, they go shopping, they go to the fireworks, and therefore Leary's Spirits beforehand, perhaps, to get a beer or two. So it is very important to the economy, and again, that's kind of why we do this show. This is Life Along the Merrimack. I am host Dyke Hendrickson, and we're heard on 96.3 FM and also on the local cable TV, Cablevision network, and we're repeated several times over the weekend. So I do mention that. And when we talk about the Merrimack, it must be remembered it has really an awesome history. And I've written several books about the Merrimack River. In fact, I am the outreach historian for the Custom House Maritime Museum, and I'm working on an exhibit that's going to run from say, Manchester, New Hampshire, down to Newburyport, showing the river as it looked years ago and how it looks today. And the subliminal message here is it's worth saving. But I would want to mention, let's go back and just hitting the basics of this great river. So we're in 2019. In 1619, the Merrimack River had many Native Americans here. They lived, up inland into New Hampshire. In the summer, they came down to Plum Island, to Salisbury. They fished, they swam, they did the waters, as they say, and enjoyed the river and the ocean, and then would go back frequently to the villages farther up. In 1719, that marked the beginning of the shipbuilding era. Newburyport had a 117-mile river, that's the Merrimack, from which to get lumber. We were unique from Essex or Ipswich or Salem. We had a very long river, and we could get lumber for ships. And so that's why we became the leading shipbuilding community of the late 18th century. Now, some people, don't quite believe that. But Samuel Eliot Morison, one of my heroes, he was one of the great historians of the 20th century, had those exact quotes in his, History of Maritime Massachusetts. From 1790 to 1810 was the golden era of shipbuilding here in Newburyport, and he said that Newburyport was number one. And I read an interesting fact just today. Boston, as we know, is the big metropolis. But in 1776, when the Revolution was about to start, Newburyport actually had 1,000 more residents than Boston. This is true. So that puts our shipbuilding and our commercial status in a clearer picture. You might say nowadays, you'd say, how could we have made more ships than Boston? But we had 1,000 people more. We had a lot of wood coming down the river, and we were actually number one. So that is one of my great number one tales. My other great number one tale, of course, is Newburyport is the birthplace of the Coast Guard. Some people still don't fully absorb that, but this is true. And I shall get to a delightful Coast Guard story in a minute. But it started here in 1790. Okay, so we're doing this chronologically. In 1819, this marked the beginning of the textile mill era. In 1821, for instance, Boston Associates started its first large mill in Lowell. And for the next 20 years, many textile mills, wool and cotton, were built right on the Merrimack River. The technology of hydropower had been harnessed, so the power was free. They built canals, they built dikes, they built locks. In other words, so they were able to control the Merrimack, able to control their source of power. And so 1821 marked the start of the big textile revolution. About 20 years later, in 1838, 1840, the city of Lawrence was built. They built the city around the buildings, around the textile industry, not the other way around. In most cases, of course, there'll be a community and then business will crop up. Lawrence was the opposite. These financiers put up large mills in Lawrence, and they built a town around it. So in 1919, which is a century later, textiles had become huge. At one point, Lawrence and Lowell were the greatest textile producers in the world. And they would get cotton. In one of my books about the Franco-Americans who were immigrants there, has a lot of pictures of cotton coming up from the South, say in 1830, 1840, coming to the mills of Lowell and Lawrence and being made into cloth and clothing. And so this was absolutely a big industry. By 1919, which is what we're talking about, immigration was very high. I think we all know that Lawrence and Lowell had many thousands of immigrants. But also this was a time when the industry was beginning to ebb a little bit. They had hit their peak. They were still vibrant. But by 1919, it had slowed down. Also, Lawrence is remembered for the first labor strike here in the United States. That was in about 1914 in Lawrence, the Red Rose strike. And many of the workers in the textile mills just went on strike for better wages. And you can't blame them. It brought a lot of people over. It filled the cities. They did not pay them enough. And really the labor movement was started in Lawrence. So that's pretty exciting. And then moving up a century to 2019, that's where we are now. The river is a tremendous tourist attraction. It's a tremendous vehicle for commerce here in the North Shore. That is largely because of the Clean Water Act in 1971. Ed Muskie and Ted Kennedy, both senators, pushed very hard for it. And over the years, the river cleaned up. And, you know, my doubles partner, an old-timer here in Newburyport, Dick Canepa, remembers in the 50s, the Merrimack was so polluted and so smelly, the parents wouldn't let the kids go near it. Charlie Tartar, who was here last week, had a similar story. It was very polluted. It was dangerous. But because of this great EPA law of 1971, it became clean. Now we have a boating industry, a shipping industry, no, a boating industry, a shopping industry, and many people come to Newburyport. I mean, just look at the Yankee Homecoming a week or so ago. Thousands came here and enjoyed the waterfront, enjoyed everything about the river, and all of this is because of it's a clean river. So that's one of the things I think that we all want to keep in mind. The river's getting dirtier, not cleaner. And the topical reason for that is because climate change has meant we have stronger bursts of rain. And so for short periods of time, we have rainwater coming into the sewage treatment plants, and there's an overflow, and raw sewage comes out. So I think we've discussed that. There are numerous programs going on here in the North Shore. We're trying to do better. And so I will keep everybody informed about that. I did want to read just one story, one or two stories about history. One of the stories, I am the outreach historian for the Custom House Maritime Museum. I am Dyke Hendrickson, and this is Life Along the Merrimack. So I write a blog every week on the website of the Custom House Maritime Museum. And here's one of my recent ones. The headline is, Record-Breaking Dreadnought was built in Newburyport. And here we go. One of the interesting monuments in Newburyport is found along on Merrimack Street near the base of Ashland Street. It marks the fact that the Dreadnought, was a very fast clipper ship of the 19th century, was built here by William Currier and James Townsend in the 1850s. It was one of the most famous ships built and held the world record for the quickest crossing of the Atlantic. It made it in 9 days and 17 hours in 1859. Of course, that sounds like a lot now, but we all recognize things were different. Perhaps because the captain sought greater speed, it sometimes got into dangerous situations. And in fact, it was wrecked off of the coast of South America in 1869. So it had a short life, but it was the fastest vessel afloat at the time, and there's a monument on Merrimack Street near Ashland Street. And I would also mention another story that I enjoyed writing recently, and that is about how vital this river was and our port here on the river to commerce and to travel. And one of my recent blogs was, Young Men from Newburyport Join the Gold Rush. Newburyport's vibrant port of the 18th and 19th centuries enabled many local young men to travel the world. And numerous people left Newburyport and then Boston to go to California to search for gold in the mid-19th century. The gold rush took place long before the construction of the Panama Canal, and the trip around the tip of South America took weeks. And here are some lines of a local resident, Daniel Edward Plummer, who sent a letter home to his parents when he was traveling to California in 1849. It comes from archives here in Newburyport. At sea off the coast of Patagonia, June 22nd, 1849. Dear Mother and Father, it is 28 days since we left Rio de Janeiro. I do not think any ship could be more comfortable than our Trias, which I am on. All labor in Rio is done by slaves. I saw some with iron collars that were larger than abolitionists carry around to get sympathy for slaves at home. The slaves carry everything on their heads. I saw 25 carrying coffee. There could have been not one load under 200 pounds. The law there is if a slave tenders $200 for his or her owner, the owner is obliged to give them their freedom. That is better than our slaves get right here. And that's an interesting thought, isn't it? 1849, we still had slavery, not in New England, of course, but in the South. And yet they, in Rio, they could actually get their own freedom if they made a lot of money for the owner. That essentially did not happen here. Then our writer gets to San Francisco, September 27th, 1849. I have arrived after a passage of 170 days, so that's almost a half year. And I have seen a number of Newburyport men here, including Captain Bradbury, Bard Plummer, two of the House sons, John O.W. Brown, Anthony Hale, and Dr. Smith is also here. So isn't that curious? I'm going all that way and found, close to a dozen guys from Newburyport hanging out in San Francisco, ready to go for gold. He mentions W. Moulton is also here. He fell in the Duxbury's hold, and his head is badly hurt. As a matter of fact, a lot of people fell into the holds of ships. I have noticed that. It's slippery, the ship is rocking frequently, and there's a lot of head injuries. Father, you cannot know the anxious hours I have passed since leaving my friends. If I had known what my feelings were going to be before I left, I would not have left. As I am here, I do not want to regret my coming. My love to you and Mother, Mary and Green and all her children, Abraham, Sarah, and the girls, Uncle Joe and the wife, and all the cousins. Your ever affectionate son, Daniel. Now, isn't that interesting? Someone could leave the port of Newburyport, get on a vessel, go to San Francisco in 170 days, and then join the gold rush. In later letters, it did turn out that this Daniel Plummer was successful in California. Not everybody found gold, but many people went into trades that served the gold miners. You could drive a wagon. You could start a store. You could, clean people's guns. Or there are many elements, many jobs were created by this. So I just wanted to bring that to you. This is Life Along the Merrimack. We talk about the health and the history of the Merrimack, and I think we did that today. We talked about the kayak trip to bring attention to the need for a cleaner river. That refers to the health of the river. And we also read a couple pieces about old Newburyport. From the 19th century, both of them were. The Dreadnought was built here, and that was once the fastest clipper ship in the world, made it across to England in record time. And also, many men left port here and went to California in search of gold. There are many stories, and I will be bringing them in the future. We're going to have State Senator DiGoglio here in several weeks. She is the leader of this effort to make a cleaner Merrimack River. So I enjoy doing the program, and I hope you enjoy listening or watching. This is Life Along the Merrimack. This is Dyke Hendrickson, your host. I am the outreach historian with the Custom House Merrimack Museum. Come visit us sometime. Thank you very much, and we'll be talking again next week.